Hi, welcome to Teapot Genies. Billy, Wendy and I are here on the site of the old female factory at Parramatta. We've found marriage certificates and birth certificates of our ancestors that state that the women lived here at the female factory in the early 1800s. So we've contacted Judith Junn from Pastime Tours to tell us what the female factory was all about.
Judith, why was the female factory originally set up?
Well, when the colony was started, there was a great imbalance of the sexes, far more men than women. And that led to a lot of fights among the men, arguments, sexual harassment and rape. And according to the thinking of the day, instead of arresting the men who were causing the trouble, they built a female factory and put all the women inside so the men couldn't get to them.
What would the population of the female factory been at any one time?
Well, originally it was built for 300 women, but it became appallingly overcrowded. At its peak, there were 1,203 women in here. And of course, the women that had babies, they were also in here, so up to 250 children.
Judy, were the girls brought directly to Parramatta from the ships, or did they stay in Sydney town for a little while, or were they brought up the river?
Yes, when the transport ships came in, the women, anyone that wanted a female servant could go to the transports and choose one. But the leftovers, and that means the women that had children with them, young children, the women that were heavily pregnant, maybe women who were too old and feeble, or women that had some intellectual or physical incapacity, were the leftovers, and they were the ones that were put on the river boats and transported up the Parramatta River.
How long did it take to come up the river?
Oh, it was the easy transport route, but don't think of ease of transport today. That was still a 5 to 8 hour row up the river. So quite a long journey.
Horrific for the girls.
They would stop at the malting shovel at Kissing Point for refreshments on the way.
Water.
No, their first bread and maybe their taste of the first Australian liquor, because the malting shovel was an inn and brewery, and they would have bread and wash it down with ale.
Oh, okay. Did they have uniforms, or did they make clothes themselves, or were they assigned clothing, or what happened there?
Clothing was pretty poor. Government assigned clothing. I don't think we'd choose it today. Brown dresses, yellow petticoats, yellow jackets, and a visitor to the factory said that most of the women were stockingless, shoeless and capless. I know at one stage the women were given pieces of leather and needles and asked to try and fashion their own shoes.
What about vegetables? Did they have gardens or facilities to grow vegetables to supplement their diets?
Yes, they had flour and meat from the government store, but they were expected to grow vegetables here, and produce was brought in, but I don't think it would have been either very nutritious or very palatable. One of the convicts who was literate complained to the colonial secretary that their rice ration moved and heaved under its own volition due to its inhabitants.
Poetically put.
Yes, to say it was full of weevils.
Judith, when the girls arrived in Sydney and came up the river to Parramatta, were they expected here? I mean, did the officials here have the lists of names of the girls that were arriving?
I don't think they would have had prior lists of names, because remember, it took 6 months to come out on the ship. So, but they did come up under military guard. The Marines brought them here from Sydney. Some of those journeys were quite incredible and lasted a lot longer than they were meant to. So, although it was a 5 to 8 hour row up the river, some of them lasted 12 hours and more. And they got out at the wharf at Parramatta and then were walked 2 by 2 up here. And sometimes they linked arm in arm with their military guard and staggered along, and sang bawdy songs, and it was evident that they'd been fraternising on the journey and maybe drinking a little too much at Squire's Inn. The ship's surgeon was from then on asked to bring them up to Parramatta, and they would have brought all the paperwork from Sydney with them.
And on arrival, how were they housed and fed?
Well, it was pretty appalling. There were no beds. They were told to sleep on the unwashed wool that they were about to spin into the cloth that they made here. So can you imagine the stench in summer? You know what unwashed wool smells like.
And unwashed women.
Yes, indeed. And they had to cook their own food. But I should imagine that that was much more regularised when there was the very large number here in this factory. When it got to 1,203 women, they would have had to have been a more formalised cooking process for that number.
It's a big thing when you think about it, the numbers of people and to keep them busy, you know, provide activities for them. It was a lot of organisation, I expect.
They didn't have enough to do, and visitors would note that the women were very idle and that they were unwashed. They should be told to wash their children who were in poor condition. The factory was divided into third classes, third class, second class and third class. And the third class women were rock breaking. They had the hardest job. And those rocks were loaded onto wagons and then taken around the streets, the Parramatta Road to Sydney. When they got to the biggest wheel ruts, they'd push the stones off, and it was part of the road repair system. They were also unpicking old ropes to make new rope. Very hard on the hands. Very hard work indeed.
What was the water like here? Where would they have washed?
Well, there's a whole story about that. One of the buildings that was planned by Francis Greenway, who was the architect of the factory, was deleted. Governments, as they do, decided the building was too extravagant. And when the women moved in, they found it was their washrooms that had been deleted, and there was nowhere for them to wash. So they washed in open troughs in the yard for some time. When there was big numbers of women, they opened what they called the water gate, and the women walked down to the Parramatta River and washed in the river.
So the water actually was pumped up here originally or earlier on for
washing. There was a system to pump fresh water up here from the river, but then they went down and also washed in that water. That was their drinking water, and they washed clothes in it as well.
Gosh.
It was a multi-purpose river.
Yes, the end of the line too, isn't it? Judith, was the female factory considered to be a hellhole, and did the people dread coming here?
They were certainly a feisty bunch of women that didn't want to be here, and they were in appalling conditions. And it was particularly hard for those women that had children in the colony that they were separated from. So they did try to escape, and many of them did, climbed over the walls at night. And there was one major outbreak as well. It wasn't just a place where the transportees were brought straight from the ship. It was also a place of secondary punishment. So anyone committing an offence in the colony was brought in, and I've researched those through the newspapers and the bench magistrates. And that's really telling as to what was going on in society then. Hiding bread under her petticoat. She was hungry. Or hiding in the privy to escape going to church. She was probably a Catholic. And I say that because Catholics were forced to go to Anglican church services in those days. Church of England was the established church of the colony. There were many crimes they came in here for. Having the town constable secreted in her room at 9 o'clock at night. That's a bit suspect, but the town constable was sent back out to duty and she got 3 months jail.
My convict married a constable, so maybe that's how she met him.
I think the saddest reason any woman was put in the factory was a woman who was sentenced for overuse of her risible muscles to the annoyance of her mistress. Your risible muscles are the muscles that make you smile. Maybe she was a bouncy country lass that grated on her mistress's nerves. But at the other end of the spectrum, maybe she was smiling very saucily at the mistress's husband. But just very sad to be in jail for 3 months for smiling too much.
Judith, was there a system in place for employing the girls from here?
The only way you could get out of here was to be assigned from first class. So in at third class, behave yourself for a set amount of time, you'd be moved up into second class, stay there for a short period, behave yourself up into first class. From first class, settlers that needed a convict, nursery maid, dairy maid, they could come and apply. And if they wanted someone, they could write to the factory, and someone eligible to go out would be selected and maybe put on a wagon and sent to a new master in Bathurst. Yes, the mountains.
How did they meet the men that they were about to marry?
Every now and then, the Reverend Samuel Marsden, who was both the chief cleric of the colony and Parramatta's magistrate, would announce that there was going to be a marriage fair here. And that was announced publicly to the colony. And anyone that wanted a wife would come and select one. Convict men who wanted a wife would get a 3-day leave pass. And that would be 1 day to walk here, a day to make a selection and marry, and a day to walk her home.
Good girl.
So I'm sure the women would straighten their clothes, maybe have a bit of a wash and brush up, and be lined up. And at the appointed hour, the men would come in and walk up and down and select someone.
If they didn't want to marry that particular man, did they have the option of saying no?
Oh, they certainly did. But they seldom said no, because it was their opportunity to get out of prison. They might have been going from the frying pan to the fire, but they were willing to take that chance.
Thank you, Judith, for sharing your wealth of knowledge today. It's hard for us to imagine these days what hardships these girls endured, and it's wonderful that people like you can remind us of our history.
Oh, look, thank you for the opportunity for sharing my passion with you. I have a love of these people and want to raise their profile. And I don't care if they came here in chains or lied and stole and got drunk and were thrown into prison. I think it was the spirit that these people had that helped to found the Australia we know today.
If you have any topics that you would like us to cover here at Teapot Genies, or if you have any places that you would like us to visit, please feel free to email us. Or if you're having any trouble with your own family history, you can email us and we can also see if we can try and help.
There's a lot more information on the Female Factory at the State Records Office at the Rocks and at Kingswood. But for now, ladies, how about a cup of tea?
I do, yes.